6 years, 60 countries, and somewhere between 70 and 85 million people who would not live to see the end of it. The Second World War is the single biggest thing our species has ever done to itself. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. It didn't come from nowhere. It was built by a handful of men, a failed painter, a bank robber turned tyrant, and a washed-up old politician nobody wanted. Let's meet them and watch them build the apocalypse. To understand this war, you have to start with the last one. In 1918, the First World War ended, and the winners sat down to punish the loser. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of land, its army, and its pride, and handed it a bill so gigantic that the last scrap of that debt wasn't paid off until 2010. Yes, actual 2010. A war so expensive, your grandparents were still paying for it. That bill broke the German economy in half. By 1923, the money was so worthless, people literally burned it for warmth, because banknotes were cheaper than firewood. Kids built toy towers out of bricks of cash. You needed a wheelbarrow of paper to buy one loaf of bread, and by the time you reached the shop, the price had gone up again. Things briefly settled, and then, in 1929, the American stock market fell off a cliff and dragged the whole planet into the Great Depression. Germany, propped up on American loans, was hit hardest of all. Millions lost everything overnight. And here is the iron rule of history. Desperate, frightened, humiliated people go looking for two things: someone to blame and someone to follow. Right on cue, a someone appeared. He was a failed painter, rejected twice from art school, a nobody corporal from the trenches with a talent nobody had noticed yet. He could stand in front of frightened people and make them feel powerful. In 1923, drunk on ambition, he tried to seize power by force. The Beer Hall Putsch, storming a Munich beer hall with an old war hero on his arm. It was a shambles. Police scattered them in the street. He was arrested and thrown in prison. And that prison cell is where he got truly dangerous, because he learned. He spent his cushy sentence dictating a hateful autobiography, Mein Kampf, laying out exactly what he intended to do. And he drew one cold lesson from his failure. You don't grab power in the street and get shot at. You take it legally, from the inside, and let them hand it to you. His name, of course, was Adolf Hitler, and within 10 years, they handed it to him. Here's what people always get wrong. He was never elected to run Germany. In January 1933, a circle of powerful men who thought they could use him as a puppet talked the aging president into appointing him chancellor. They were sure they could control him. Within weeks, the controlling was over. A convenient fire in parliament, an emergency law, every rival banned, and Germany's young democracy was quietly strangled in its cot. It took him a matter of months. Then he did the one thing the treaty forbade. He rebuilt the war machine. Tanks, warships, an air force, millions of men in uniform, in plain sight. And the rest of the world, still traumatized from the last war and desperate to never do it again, made a fateful choice. They looked away. Remember that instinct. It's about to cost everything. And he wasn't the only strongman on the rise. Over in Italy was his idol, Benito Mussolini, the man who literally invented fascism and dreamed of a new Roman Empire. 10 years earlier, he'd marched on Rome to seize power. Though here's the delicious truth. Mussolini himself skipped the march and took the train, arriving comfy and rested to be handed the country. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, Japan's military had hijacked its own government and was already carving into China. The fire was lit on 3 continents. Nobody had realized it was all the same fire. So the great powers tried a strategy with a very polite name: appeasement. Give the bully a little of what he wants, and surely he'll calm down. So every time Hitler grabbed something, Britain and France frowned, wrote a stern letter, and let it slide. But the two men whose handshake would truly light the fuse hadn't met yet, and they hated each other. Because here's the thing about feeding a bully. He doesn't get full, he gets hungry. Every prize Hitler swallowed without a fight taught him the same lesson: nobody will ever stop me. And by 1938, he was almost right. The stage was built, the cast was in place, and the world was about to learn what too late actually feels like. It started with a bluff. In 1936, Hitler marched a small, underarmed force into the Rhineland. German land the treaty said must stay unarmed. His own generals were sweating. If France had pushed back even slightly, it was over that afternoon. France did nothing. The bluff worked. And a man who wins by bluffing learns precisely the wrong lesson. Bet bigger. So he bet bigger. March 1938, Germany swallowed Austria whole, tanks rolling into cheering crowds, calling an invasion a reunion. No war, no consequences. Next, he demanded a slice of Czechoslovakia, and Europe finally panicked, because this time it genuinely smelled like war. So the leaders flew to Munich in 1938 to make a deal. And they gave Hitler the chunk of Czechoslovakia he wanted, without asking the Czechoslovakians. Britain's prime minister flew home, waved a little slip of paper, and promised the cheering crowds, peace for our time. He genuinely believed it. He had about 11 months, because months later, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Deal be damned. And that was the moment the penny finally dropped across Europe. Appeasement hadn't bought peace. It had bought a dictator a running start. Britain and France drew their line in the sand. Touch Poland, and it's war. Hitler looked at that line and started planning to cross it. And now, that handshake. Poland sat trapped between two giants who loathed each other, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. Everyone assumed they'd never ever cooperate. So the whole world reeled when in August 1939, Hitler and Stalin, sworn screaming ideological enemies, signed a pact of friendship, and secretly agreed to carve Poland in half and split it between them. The last thing standing in Hitler's way had just been bought off with a smile and a signature. September the 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. Germany hurled itself at Poland and unleashed a terrifying new kind of war, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And it had an architect, a general named Heinz Guderian, who'd written the book, literally, on smashing tanks, dive bombers, and radio-coordinated troops through the enemy line so fast they collapsed in confusion before they could even react. This wasn't the slow trench slog of the last war. This was a hurricane with engines. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The catastrophe they'd spent 20 years desperately dodging had arrived anyway. The Second World War had officially begun, and it began over Poland, a country being erased from two directions at once. Because as Poland fought Germany in the west, Stalin's Soviet Union invaded from the east, exactly as the secret pact promised. In weeks, Poland was gone, split down the middle. And then, strangely, nothing. For months, the armies in the west just sat and stared at each other across the border. They nicknamed it the Phony War. It was the held breath before something monstrous. Then, spring 1940, the breath let out. Germany swallowed Denmark in a single day and stormed Norway. But the real prize was France, and France looked unbeatable, hidden behind a giant wall of forts called the Maginot Line. So a German general named Erich von Manstein proposed something everyone else called insane. Don't hit the wall. Send the tanks through the Ardennes, a dense forest the French swore no army could ever cross, and had barely bothered to guard. On the 10th of May, 1940, they did the impossible. Guderian's tanks poured through that forest, a maneuver the British would later nickname the Sickle Cut, burst across the river, and suddenly appeared behind the entire Allied army. In days, the Germans sliced the Allied forces in two and pinned hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers against the sea at a port called Dunkirk. Backs to the water. No ships anywhere near big enough to save them. And then, one of the strangest rescues in history. Britain put out a call, and hundreds of ordinary people answered. Fishermen, weekend sailors, pleasure boat owners pointed their little civilian boats across the channel and went to fetch their army home. Over 300,000 men, carried to safety by a ragtag fleet of holiday yachts and paddle steamers. It wasn't a victory, but it meant Britain still had an army left to fight with. But make no mistake, France fell. In 6 weeks. The nation that had held for 4 brutal years in the last war collapsed in a month and a half, and Hitler danced a giddy little jig for the cameras. He now controlled most of Europe. Britain stood completely, utterly alone. So plant a flag right here, because from this peak, Hitler is about to make the single decision that turns him from unstoppable into doomed. Enter the third man from our opening, the washed-up one nobody wanted. For a decade, Winston Churchill had been a political joke, exiled to the sidelines, growling unfashionable warnings about Hitler that everyone rolled their eyes at. And then, on the 10th of May 1940, the very day the tanks rolled west, Britain looked around in a panic and realized the mocked old man had been right all along. They made him prime minister, and he stood up and told a terrified nation, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," and that they would never, ever surrender. Unable to invade across the Channel, Hitler decided to break Britain from the sky first. So came the Battle of Britain, history's first battle fought entirely in the air. Wave after wave of German bombers, met by a thin line of exhausted young pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, wildly outnumbered, flying until they could barely climb out of the cockpit. Somehow, impossibly, they held. Never, said Churchill, was so much owed by so many to so few. So Hitler switched targets from the airfields to the cities. For months, German bombers pounded London night after night in what Britons grimly called the Blitz. Families slept in underground stations. Whole streets vanished by breakfast. It was designed to shatter British morale. Instead, spitefully, it hardened it. Turns out you cannot bomb a stubborn people into being less stubborn. Now, quick breath, because the war's about to go global and gloriously strange. Hold, 2 questions. 1. Were the Nazis really building secret superweapons, or is that a myth? And 2. I promise this is real. How did a fully grown bear end up officially enlisted with a rank and a serial number as a soldier? We'll get to both. First, the 2 decisions that turned a European war into a world one. First, the war spilled into the deserts of North Africa and gave us its most glamorous villain. A brilliant, dashing German general named Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who chased the British back and forth across the sand and seemed impossible to beat. Until Britain sent a prickly, meticulous little man in a black beret, Bernard Montgomery. At El Alamein, in October 1942, Monty finally broke the fox. Of that victory, Churchill said, "This is not the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." And the war was quietly being won by nerds. In a country house called Bletchley Park, a team of codebreakers, including a young genius named Alan Turing, cracked Germany's unbreakable Enigma machine. For years, the Allies could secretly read Hitler's mail. Some historians think it shortened the entire war by 2 years. The most powerful weapon in Britain was a chalkboard. Remember the codebreakers, because later they go hunting. And now, the fatal decision. In June 1941, with Britain still undefeated behind him, Hitler betrayed his handshake with Stalin and turned east, launching the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million men pouring into the Soviet Union. He was so certain of a lightning win that his troops weren't even issued winter coats. Remember the coats? But he had one enormous secret advantage. And unbelievably, Stalin had handed it to him himself. Because a few years earlier, Stalin had done something insane. He'd murdered his own army. In a paranoid purge, he executed 3 of his 5 top marshals and roughly 35,000 officers, beating fake confessions out of his best military minds, and leaving the Red Army leaderless right as the Nazis attacked. And Stalin, warned again and again the invasion was coming, simply refused to believe it. By his own deputy's later account, when it hit, he retreated to his country house in stunned silence, half expecting to be arrested for what he'd done. At first, the invasion worked spectacularly, swallowing hundreds of miles and millions of prisoners. But you cannot quite finish the Soviet Union. It's simply too big. As the Soviets fell back, they burned everything behind them: crops, factories, homes, leaving the invaders nothing but scorched earth and impossible distance. And behind that distance came a general no army has ever beaten. And what a winter! 40 below zero. German tanks froze solid. Engines wouldn't turn. Men in summer uniforms froze at their posts, within sight of Moscow's towers. And then the Soviets unleashed their counterpunch, led by the man who becomes the war's great Soviet hammer, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. With fresh troops rushed from Siberia, Zhukov threw the frostbitten Germans back from the gates of the capital. For the very first time, the unstoppable army had been stopped. And then, half a world away, the second decision that changed everything. On December the 7th, 1941, Japan launched a devastating surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Its architect was an admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto. And here's the tragic irony. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He'd seen America's colossal factories with his own eyes. And he privately warned he could run wild for 6 months, but had utterly no confidence in a long war. He knew it was a gamble he'd probably lose. He rolled the dice anyway. And you may have heard he sighed that he'd woken a sleeping giant. He never said it. That's a line from a movie. But it was completely true. The next day, America declared war, its president calling it a date which will live in infamy, a phrase he'd scrawled by hand over the blander words he'd first typed. Days later, Hitler declared war on America too. Just like that, every great power on earth was in the same war. It was now, truly, a world war. And for 6 terrifying months, Japan seemed invincible, sweeping across the Pacific faster than anyone believed possible, while Russia bled in the snow and Britain reeled. If you'd placed a bet in early 1942, you'd have bet on the dictators. And then the war turned. Not everywhere. In 2 places. 2 names. The first name, Midway, June 1942. Japan set a trap for America's last aircraft carriers. But remember those codebreakers? America had cracked the Japanese code too, and set a trap right back. In a few staggering minutes, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers, the beating heart of their fleet. Japan never truly recovered. The Pacific turned on code-breaking, luck, and about 5 unbelievable minutes. The second name, Stalingrad. Hitler hurled his armies at this one city on the Volga, and it became the most savage battle in human history. A frozen hell of house-to-house, room-to-room fighting, where a new soldier's life expectancy was measured in hours, and both sides fed men into it like coal into a furnace. To hold it, Stalin issued Order No. 227, not one step back, and posted troops behind his own lines to shoot anyone who fled. And then, Zhukov sprang the trap. In a massive pincer, the Soviets swept around the city and surrounded the entire German army inside it. 330,000 men, cut off, starving, freezing, forbidden by Hitler to retreat. In February 1943, the frostbitten survivors surrendered. Hitler's fatal decision had now cost him an entire army. He was losing on every side. And here's the unglamorous secret of why the Allies won. Arithmetic. America's factories, safe across an ocean, were building war faster than anyone on Earth could destroy it. A ship a day, a plane every few minutes, mountains of tanks and boots. You can be the finest soldier alive, but you cannot outfight a spreadsheet. And now, because we promised, 3 of the strangest true stories of the entire war. Meet Wojtek, a real bear, a brown bear cub adopted by Polish soldiers, who grew up in the army, drank beer, wrestled the men, and adored a hot bath. But soldiers can't have a pet bear at the front, so they didn't. They officially enlisted him. Private Wojtek, with a rank, a paybook, and a serial number. And at the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino, he reportedly carried crates of live artillery shells to the guns, under fire, without dropping one. A literal soldier bear. I told you it was real. Story 2, the Ghost Army. America built an entire combat unit whose only weapon was lies. Artists, actors, and sound engineers who deployed inflatable rubber tanks, fake radio chatter, and giant speakers blasting recorded army noise. To convince the Germans, whole divisions were somewhere they weren't. They bluffed their way across Europe. Their tanks could be popped by a startled cow, and they helped win very real battles. Story 3, Operation Mincemeat. To hide where they'd invade next, British intelligence took a dead body, dressed it as an officer, chained a briefcase of totally fake secret plans to its wrist, and let it wash ashore where the Germans would find it. And they did, and they believed it. Hitler moved his defenses to the wrong place, outfoxed by a corpse with a made-up name and a fake love letter tucked in his pocket. And my favorite, the Night Witches, a regiment of Soviet women who flew bombing raids in flimsy wooden canvas biplanes, so ancient they were basically crop dusters. Their trick? Near the target, they'd cut their engines and glide in dead silent, so the only warning the enemy ever got was the soft whoosh of wind over the wings, a heartbeat before the bombs fell. The terrified Germans gave them the name, They wore it like a medal. And remember the code breakers I told you to remember? Here's their darkest trick. In 1943, they decrypted the flight plan of Admiral Yamamoto himself, the man who'd planned Pearl Harbor. American fighters were waiting in the sky, exactly where the code said he'd be, and they shot his plane out of the air over the Pacific. The man who started America's war was killed by the very thing that would end Japan's: broken codes. So the true stories are wild enough. Which is exactly why this war grew a shadow of legends, tales that sit right on the blurry line between history and myth. And the biggest legends of all are about secret weapons. So let's do this honestly. What was real and what was rumor? Because the truth is stranger than either. Start with what was terrifyingly real. Germany's scientists were genuinely years ahead. They built the world's first cruise missile and the first true ballistic missile, the V1 and V2, rockets that fell on London from the edge of space with no warning at all. They flew the first operational jet fighter. This is not myth. The Nazis really were racing toward weapons the rest of the world hadn't even imagined. Which is why the rumors found such fertile ground. Allied pilots reported strange glowing balls of light trailing their planes over Germany. They called them Foo Fighters, and to this day nobody's fully explained them. And then there's the Bell, Die Glocke, a supposed top-secret Nazi device, whispered about in later books as everything from an anti-gravity machine to a time machine. Here's the honest part. There is zero solid evidence it ever existed. It's a legend. A magnificent one, but a legend. And the wildest myths came after the war. That Hitler faked his death and escaped by submarine to a secret base in Antarctica. Or a hideout in Argentina. Fun? Absolutely. True? No. The evidence says he died in a bunker in Berlin, which we'll get to. But the fact these stories spread so far tells you something real. The Nazi war machine was strange and secretive enough that people believed it could do literally anything. That fear was a weapon all its own. Back to the real ending. Because the trap was closing. In 1943, the Allies knocked Italy out of the war, and Mussolini's own people turned on him. Night after night, thousands of Allied bombers pounded German cities from above. Germany was now being crushed from the east, the south, and the sky. All that remained was a punch from the west, and to land it, the Allies pulled off the greatest deception in military history. And the star of that deception was America's most flamboyant general, George Patton. Old blood and guts, a swaggering showman with ivory-gripped pistols, and don't you dare call them pearl. He snapped that only a pimp carries a pearl-handled pistol. Patton was so famous and so feared that the Allies put him in charge of an army that didn't exist, a phantom force of those inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic. To convince Hitler the invasion would strike at Calais. Hitler bought it and kept his best troops guarding the wrong beach. And the man who had to give the real order was General Dwight Eisenhower. The invasion needed perfect tides and a clear sky, and a storm was rolling in. As hundreds of thousands of men waited, one weatherman spotted a tiny gap in the clouds. Eisenhower had seconds to bet everything on it. He reportedly took a breath and said, "Okay, we'll go." And quietly in his pocket, he tucked a note to release if it all went wrong, taking the entire blame himself. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. In the gray dawn, the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted hit the beaches of Normandy. Over 5,000 ships, thousands of aircraft, 150,000 men storming ashore into a wall of fire. The cost was horrific. But by nightfall, the Allies were back in France to stay. The western door had been kicked in, and Germany was now caught in a vice with no way out. Now the jaws slammed shut. The Allies pushed east through France, liberating Paris to weeping, dancing crowds. And from the other direction came Zhukov's Red Army, enormous, vengeful, unstoppable now, grinding west through everything Germany had stolen, heading straight for Berlin. But before we reach the end, we have to stop. Because as the soldiers pushed into Nazi territory, they began to open gates that had until that moment been only rumors. And this next part has no jokes in it. Behind those gates was the Holocaust. The deliberate, industrial murder of 6 million Jewish people, men, women, and children, alongside millions of others the Nazis deemed unworthy of life, Roma, disabled people, prisoners, and countless more. It was not a byproduct of the war. It was a purpose of it, planned and carried out with bureaucratic cruelty. The battle-hardened soldiers who liberated the camps described what they found as beyond anything they had believed a human being was capable of. We say the number, 6 million, but a number that vast goes numb. So hold just one truth instead. Every single one was a person, a name, a favorite song, a mother, a joke they always told. This is the weight the entire war rests upon. And it is why, whenever anyone is tempted to turn the past into just an adventure story, we stop, and we remember exactly what was lost. As for the men who did it, one by one, the fates caught up. Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland. Partisans caught him near a lake, shot him, and hung his body upside down in a Milan square for the crowds. The strongman who invented fascism ended as a warning, dangling over the very people he'd ruled. And in the final days, the man who started it all hid underground. As Zhukov's shells rained on Berlin above him, and his empire collapsed into rubble, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker on the 30th of April, 1945. The 1,000-year Reich he'd screamed about lasted 12 years. The most feared man on earth ended in a concrete hole in the ground, hiding from every consequence he'd built. There was one more cruel twist. The American president, Franklin Roosevelt, who had steered his nation through nearly the entire war, died suddenly of a stroke in April 1945, just weeks before the victory he'd fought for. He never got to see it. And a week after Hitler's death, on the 8th of May, Germany surrendered. The papers accepted by Marshal Zhukov himself in the ruins of Berlin. Victory in Europe. But there's always a but. The war was not over. On the far side of the world, it still raged. American forces were clawing toward Japan, island by bloody island, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and every mile got more terrible. Planners looked at the cost of invading Japan itself and saw a bloodbath measured in millions on both sides. And that grim arithmetic set up the most fateful decision of the entire war. Because, in a secret desert lab, American physicists had just built something new under the sun, the atomic bomb. A single weapon with the force of thousands. The war that began with men on horseback was about to end with a power torn straight out of the atom. On the 6th of August, 1945, one bomb erased most of the city of Hiroshima in a flash of light. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. And then, something unprecedented. For the first time in history, the ordinary people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor, a recording played over the radio in language so formal most could barely follow it. He never once used the word surrender. He simply told them, in the greatest understatement ever spoken, that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was over. On the 2nd of September 1945, the papers were signed. After 6 years, across every ocean on Earth, the Second World War was finally completely done. And then, a stunned planet stepped out into the silence to count what it had lost. The number is almost impossible to hold in your mind. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people were dead. Around 3 of every 100 human beings alive on Earth. Whole cities were ash. Whole countries had to be built again from nothing. There has never been anything else like it, before or since. And the survivors made one promise above all. Never again. So, they built something to keep that promise. From the ruins rose the United Nations, a place for enemies to argue with words instead of armies. Empires crumbled, borders were redrawn, and 2 nations rose from the wreckage bigger than all the rest, the United States and the Soviet Union. The very allies who had just crushed Hitler together. Which brings us to the strangest twist of all. Because the instant their common enemy was gone, those 2 victorious giants turned and squared up to face each other. The friendship that won the war curdled almost overnight into a new kind of standoff, fought with spies and threats and the shadow of those same atomic bombs held over the whole world for the next 40 years. They called it the Cold War. World War II didn't just end an era, it armed the next one. But how the 2 allies who beat Hitler became the bitterest rivals on Earth, that is a story all of its own.